In 1929, it was estimated that every week bootleggers brought 22,000 gallons of whiskey, moonshine, and other spirits into Washington, D.C.'s 3,000 speakeasies. H.L. Mencken called Prohibition the 13 awful years, though it was 16 for the district. I'm Garrett Peck, the author of Prohibition in Washington, D.C., How Dry We Weren't. In the next few minutes, I'll share some brief highlights from the book, which was published in March 2011 by the History Press. The book is based almost entirely on primary research. It tells the story of how Prohibition unraveled in the nation's capital. Far from being a model dry city, the denizens of Washington actively disregarded and undermined the law. To start off, I lead the Temperance Tour of Prohibition-related sites in Washington, which I mostly lead through Walkingtown, D.C., our twice-annual extravaganza of free historic tours in the nation's capital. I expanded the tour into a book that covers all of Washington's Prohibition past. You can learn more about the Temperance Tour at temperanceTour.com. The book starts off with an overview of how the temperance movement declared a culture war against alcohol, and that ultimately gave us Prohibition in 1920. Now, how many other cities can boast that they have a temperance fountain, which is what you see here? Well, Washington can, and it's at a primo location, halfway between the White House and the Capitol, where it tried to tell people to drink water, not whiskey. In the Temperance Tour, we hit some really unusual sites, places that even most Washingtonians walk past without really noticing, and these stories are really core to my book, Prohibition in Washington, D.C. You'll learn about places like Calvary Baptist Church, where the Anti-Saloon League had its first national convention in 1895, or the Woodrow Wilson House, the former president's home, which still houses a Prohibition-era wine cellar and original bottles. It's pretty cool to see. 5 presidents occupied the White House during Prohibition, and I tell each of their stories. The book is not only a history, it's also a guidebook for exploring Washington's Prohibition past. It includes 80 historic and modern images, 11 vintage cocktail recipes, such as the Ricky and the Mamie Taylor, and 5 neighborhood maps to show where all the mayhem occurred. Throughout the book, there are a number of before and after images, such as this one. This is a 1908 postcard that shows Rum Row, a block of D.C.'s finest drinking establishments. The most famous of these bars was Shoemaker's, where the Ricky was invented in the 1880s and is D.C.'s claim to cocktail fame. Shoemaker's is in the center right of the postcard, just behind the trees. The after photo shows what Rum Row looks like today. Everything to the left of the National Theater was once Rum Row. It's now occupied by the J.W. Marriott Hotel. As I discovered in writing this book, Prohibition was widely disregarded in the nation's capital. There were up to 3,000 speakeasies in the city, which was 10 times the number of legal saloons that had existed before dry law began. One observer wrote in 1929, "The city is so wet that it squishes." Raids were frequent, such as this one at the Carl Hamill lunchroom, but there was so much money to be made bootlegging or opening a speakeasy that for many it was worth the risk. I wrote a whole chapter called 16 Awful Years to cover how endemic the lawbreaking was across the city. One of the interesting things about Prohibition in D.C. was that there was very little violence. Unlike other major American cities, Washington didn't have organized crime. Bootleggers were solidly amateurs, and anyone could get in on the game, including women and African Americans. One of the key questions I addressed was, what did African Americans think about Prohibition? This is a question that's hardly ever been asked, but it's especially important given that the population of Washington was 25% black at the time, and the great migration of blacks out of the Deep South coincided with Prohibition. I found that researching African American attitudes about Prohibition was difficult, given the institutional racism of white newspapers, which refused to cover black stories, and the black press, which is more concerned about lynching and fairness in employment. Probably half of my research time in developing the book went to exploring this question, and I dedicated an entire chapter to the subject called the Jim Crow Annex. Probably the most famous bootlegger in Washington's history is this man. His name was George Cassidy, and he was known as the Man in the Green Hat. He worked as a bootlegger for Congress for 10 years. What was so unusual about Cassidy is that he told his story as a bootlegger in grand style, in 5 front-page articles in the Washington Post a week before the 1930 midterm election. What he wrote shocked the nation. Cassidy estimated that 4/5 of congressmen were his customers. This was a huge betrayal for the dry cause, which had always counted Congress as its ally. Another remarkable story about the unraveling of Prohibition was the role of a group called the Crusaders. They produced maps in 1930 and 1932 showing where speakeasies had been raided across Washington. These were reproduced in newspapers nationwide. It further undermined the dry cause, as it showed that the nation's capital was anything but a model dry city. Once Prohibition ended in Washington on March 1, 1934, the Crusaders proposed a licensing and taxation authority for the city. This was during the worst of the Great Depression, and allowing legal, licensed saloons created several thousand jobs and brought in much-needed revenue for the city's coffers. Like the nation, Congress realized it was better to license and tax alcohol rather than allow lawbreaking to run amok. Prohibition ultimately failed as the country turned its back on the dry cause. So where can you buy Prohibition in Washington, D.C.? The book is available on the publisher's website, which is historypress.net. Of course, you can also order it on Amazon.com. I want to thank you for your time and support for authors such as myself. It's because of our enthusiastic readers such as you that we bring new stories to market, and I really hope you enjoy Prohibition in Washington, D.C., and that you'll tell others about your reading experience. This has been Garrett Peck. You can contact me through my website, garrettpeck.com, or via the book's Facebook page. I hope you enjoy this journey through D.C.'s Prohibition past.